My name is Caitlin. I'm a senior social worker working in Framework. I specifically work on the street outreach services, but a huge part of my role is also delivering training. I've been delivering training around neurodivergence for the last 2 or 3 years now, and usually it overlaps with the SMD side of things. Just to kick things off, so today the hopes are what you guys are going to get out of the training is a little bit more clarity on what the terminology is that surrounds neurodivergence. We're going to be looking at the umbrella term, but we'll also be looking at the few little stems out from the word so that there's a clear understanding of what that means. We're also going to look at some insights into the overlap of neurodivergence and multiple disadvantage, specifically relevant for people who are working with those who are experiencing homelessness, substance use, offending, mental health, domestic abuse, and all that overlap. We'll be looking at why neurodivergent affirmative approaches are essential when working with people experiencing SMD and giving a little bit of tips and tricks that might encourage best practice as the overall aim. As this is an introductory session, there might be a few things that you already know, there might be some things you don't know. Apologies if you've done a similar training with me before, there might be a little bit of overlap, but hopefully we can get something in there that you've not seen. And before I get started properly, I just wanted to give a very quick disclaimer of the fact that neurodivergence is a very broad topic. It's extremely subjective. Everyone's going to have their own experiences. A lot of the topics I'm going to talk about today are going to have to be generalized. If I didn't generalize them, then we'd be here for far longer than I think any of you guys would want to be listening to me. I've tried to condense the training that I typically take roughly a day to deliver with a bunch of breaks into an hour and a half long session. As I've just mentioned, each neurodivergent individual, but even past that, every single person has their own unique experiences, strengths, difficulties, culture, upbringing, everything. So their brains and the way that they interact with this is going to be different. The advice that I give might come across as generalized. It might not work for some people, might work great for others. But hopefully it just gives you an overview of neurodivergence as the umbrella term, and it will break down some condition-specific topics. Just remember, try not to stick in that box too rigidly. So if we look at the topic of what neurodivergence actually means, a lot of the times when people hear the term neurodivergence, I think it's quite natural for your mind to go straight to autism, ADHD, kind of the key things that tend to jump out, at least they did for me, especially when I was learning about it. But it's important to recognize that these differences in how people's brains work stems not only across every single person, but a load more different conditions. So we can be talking about things like processing differences like dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia. Also looking at things that might be a little bit more medical, so epilepsy, Tourette's or tic disorders. And then it also includes intellectual disabilities or things like acquired brain injuries, so not necessarily born with, but the way that your brain changes and develops as you grow and get older. I think it's important to recognize, especially for a bit more of a disclaimer for you guys, my background tends to be around autism and ADHD. Not only was I diagnosed with both of them when I was around about 21, and that's where a lot of my interest came from. I went into a deep dive and learned pretty much as I can about neurodivergence in adults. But a lot of the research tends to be based around autism and ADHD. I'll go into a little bit more of the complexities around that, but just bear in mind that with the generalization, it might be slightly rigid, specific to those two. Again, the words that I'm using today are words that matter. So when I'm talking about things of people being autistic, when I'm talking about neurodivergence, the way in which we're using our language is really important in general. When you're working with service users, working with staff, or just like today, speaking about the topic in a broad sense. Typically, we're always advocating for inclusive and non-judgmental language. That's going to be the goal and the outcomes from today's training. But there's also a conversation that's really important that people tend to have around the difference between identity first language and person first language. So what I mean by that is referring to someone as an autistic person versus a person with autism. There's something called the Actually Autistic movement online, and there's quite a bit of discourse about it, but it has been found that overwhelmingly, at least from everything that I've read over the last couple of years, autistic adults tend to prefer the identity first language. They see autism as a part of them, the way that they interact with the world, the way that they behave and take in and put out information. But there are some people that prefer to be classed as a person with autism or a person with ADHD or a person who's neurodivergent, whatever those words might be. I think it's really important for staff to just avoid assumptions in general, ask directly what the person's preferred language is or a way to be addressed. There's not necessarily one right way or wrong way of doing it, but just gives a bit of preface to how I'm speaking, the words that I'm using, and why. Something else that I also like to touch on is the idea of the spectrum. So it comes up in quite a lot of different neurodivergent conditions or conversations about a spectrum. And sometimes it's very easy to hear the word spectrum and view it in a linear sense, a line from least to most, from highest to lowest, whatever it might be. It's really important to try and adapt our language around what a spectrum actually looks like and the spiky profile that is used to describe it. Spiky profile looks at it from less of that linear sense and recognizes that the autism spectrum or neurodivergent spectrums in general tend to look more like strengths and difficulties or challenges in different areas. Looking at someone or their support needs as just that. Someone could have great strengths in things like social interactions or executive function, but they could really struggle with emotional regulation. They could really struggle with the sensory sensitivities and need a bit more support to navigate that. Terms that people can start using, like high functioning or low functioning, tend to be quite harmful. It's almost like referring to someone as a high functioning or low functioning human being. It's not something that we tend to use. Although in saying that, it is very easy to slip into those routines. It's just something to be cautious of. That spectrum shouldn't be viewed as linear. And when I'm talking about support needs, whether that be higher or lower, by no means am I talking about someone who is less or more neurodivergent, because it doesn't really exist. So back to what I was talking about initially, the terminology, what neurodiversity means, what neurodivergent means. I tend to break it down like this just because I think it's fairly easy to go through. Bear in mind, it is quite nuanced, so this might be generalized, but every human being in the world is neurodiverse. We've all got neurodiversity because we've all got different brains. The way that you and I were raised is different. The values that we have are going to be different. Everything about our lives and how we are framed will be different. That impacts the way that we interact with the world, the way that we speak to others, treat others, react to things. Some of us might have higher tolerances to some emotional settings. Some of us might have lower tolerances, but we are all different. So that falls into the neurodiversity. And then from that, it tends to be split into neurotypical or neurodivergent. So a neurotypical person is someone with society's typical brain functioning. I like to hone in on the word typical because I don't know what it means. I don't think any of us know what a typical person is. But general rule of thumb, the world is set up in a way that most people can interact with fairly, or at least a level of ease. If we flip that and look at someone whose brain functions differently to society's typical states, the neurodivergent, it might be more difficult for them to interact with the world the way that it is set up, in terms of processing information, attending appointments, whatever that looks like. I know that the word typical can tend to feel quite rigid, but it's just another way of thinking about it. Neurodivergence can be brought into specific conditions. So the ones we were speaking about earlier, the autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, all those things that change the way that information is processed and changes the neural pathways of how the brain takes in and puts out information. We're just trying to look at the differences between what might be seen as typical, whether or not that exists, obviously, and then what we're talking about today is just someone who interacts with the world in a different way to society's typical state, and it might make it more difficult for them to go about their days in the barriers that are set up. So without kind of bringing it into very specific aspects of neurodiverse conditions or diagnostic pathways, the goal of today is not to go away and try and start diagnosing people. The goal of today is not to try and walk away and say this person is definitely autistic, they've definitely got dyslexia, whatever it might be. It's mainly just to give staff the tools to be able to recognize what might come up, what possible traits you can see, and how you can adapt your practice to get better results or work with that person in a way that works best for them. Some of the common things that comes up across most neurodivergent conditions, or the traits that tend to be prevalent across most people, fall into one of these three different categories, or times two or all three. Communication differences is a big one. So there might be different preferences. That could just be around, does that person prefer face-to-face contact, or would they be more comfortable speaking over the phone, via text, via email? Where do they want to meet? How do they want to meet? And how do they want to be communicated with? Some people can struggle massively with eye contact, and that could go 1 to 2 side, far too little or far too much with how people perceive their interactions with them. There could be difficulties around misinterpreting or missing nonverbal cues. Something that I always mention is the fact that I tend to like things face to face when I deliver trainings or meet with people in general. Although recognizing that if I sat in front of, 113 different people right now in front of me, it'd probably be a bit more stress. But it does make it easier to see facial expressions, to see body language, and pick up on the nonverbal aspects. It could be more difficult for people who are neurodivergent to pick up on that, whether you're face to face or not. It's something that you tend to learn through the years, and some people are more aware of it than others. Some people might pick up on it more than others, but missing those nonverbal cues can make communication quite a bit different. It can be found that some people who are neurodivergent might be more direct. They might be a bit more blunt. There's questions to be raised around the socialization differences and what the social norms look like for every person. But that directness might be seen as abrasive by some people. If we move on to the social interaction differences, so differences in body language, the way that people react non-verbally to situations that are happening. Attention, regulation, and impulse control, so the ability to maintain attention, focus on something for a prolonged period of time, or control impulses and stop them from making decisions that might benefit them in the now, but might come back to bite them in the future. They could also be differences in facial expressions for some people. So their face maybe not matching the emotion that they are currently feeling can come up in quite a few different neurodivergent people, and it's a common trait that we find. There's also a huge aspect which comes under the sensory needs. So that's just any difference in sensory processing, any of the 5 main senses. With the differences, it can be either hyper, so feeling or hearing things to such a high extent that it can become very, very overwhelming, and situations that might seem like normal for someone, whether that be like going to the Christmas markets that are coming up now, going to a club, all the lights and sounds and everything could be extremely overwhelming for another person, the way that they process that. On the flip side, the hyposensitivities, people who are neurodivergent might struggle with feeling things the same way that it might be felt by another person. I worked with someone who really struggled to feel pain, especially if they were focused on something else so intently, where they would put their hand on something like the radiator and wouldn't feel the fact that it was burning them until it was quite a while on from the point they initially put their hand down, because they were so intently focused on something else. That sensitivity wasn't coming through. Again, we're just talking about differences in the way that your brain or someone else's brain is processing the information that's being sent to it. There could also be specified likes or dislikes. Again, with the senses, that's lighting, temperature, tactile, taste, sounds. Since I was a very, very young child, I had to have everything cut out of the back of my clothes because the tags just felt overwhelming. It would ruin a better part of my day until it came out. But there's also things around, some people might really struggle to eat home cooked meals. Same ingredients, same recipe, texture might turn out different every single time. There's not the same level of routine that might come with that they might get from a bag of Doritos or Pringles that taste the same, look the same, feel the same every single time. Lastly, from the sensory needs, it could have an impact on people's ability to focus or regulate their emotions. The sensory input that's happening might feel too overwhelming, that their ability to focus on something else that's happening is inhibited by all the information that's being sent to their brain, whether they're hearing it, seeing it, whatever that might look like. Looking at complexity in general. So I mentioned early on that a lot of this is going to have to be generalizations, but just a quick note on the complexities that we face when we talk about this topic, especially when we're overlapping it with SMD. There can be a huge overlap between neurodivergent presentations and other difficulties, whether that be attachment, mental health difficulties, or cognitive impairments, acquired brain injuries, whatever that might look like. we tend to find a lot of coexisting signs, traits, symptoms, whatever you want to call them. It can be really difficult for staff or even for specialists to differentiate between potential diagnoses or traits or where they stem from. It's really important, I think, when you do a training, understandably so, a few days, maybe a week or so after the training, you tend to be seeing signs of what you were talking about everywhere you look. It's very likely that you'll come out of this training and you'll be spotting things around neurodivergence that you may have not picked up on before, but it's really important to mention that neurodivergence and other difficulties might coexist. It could compound the difficulties or the symptoms, and it's really important to consider the additional or coexisting impacts that might have, as well as consider what specialist assessments, consultations, support might be required to unpick this. So if someone's had a brain injury and they've not gotten the support for it, whatever that might look like, and it's assumed that it is neurodivergence, that's great in terms of the support that's being provided for the person, but there could be something underlying that needs unpicking by a specialist, whether that be the trauma, the physical health difficulties that come with that, or just something outside of neurodivergence. So just keep the curiosity and know that although it's great to pick up on additional factors that might require some extra support or adjustments, don't look at it from too narrow of a box and have a little bit more of a flex to the way that you're looking at these things. In general, I like to give across some communication tips. So that's looking at anyone that you think might struggle with some of those traits that I was talking about before, or with a drop curve that we're trying to influence or create. Trying to include any of these tips I'm about to go through for any person that you work with will likely have a benefit. Just because we're talking about neurodivergence, it's really important to recognize that these are not just for people who we suspect may struggle with neurodivergence or sensory difficulties, whatever that might be. It will likely impact people in a much wider sense in a great, great way if you utilize it. So if you can ask clear and specific questions, making sure that we're not compounding questions, going through a list of 5-10 questions and trying to get all those responses back in the same way, slow it down, make sure that we're asking things very specifically, clearly, one at a time, and giving them enough time. Simplifying what we're asking or what we're explaining and making sure that we're not assuming knowledge, making sure that the person has the best understanding of what's happening, and make sure that they are able to take in the information in an effective way. If it's possible to, avoid or explain any abstract or non-literal concepts, things like idioms or phrases, sayings, whatever you might want to call it. I know when I don't know why I keep telling the story because it tends to embarrass me more than anyone, but when I first moved to the UK, I didn't realize how many different phrases British people had. I came over, I had all my bags, and a taxi driver picked me up and brought me to my accommodation. And he unpacked everything and said, right, there you go, Bob's your uncle. And the stress that came over me at the fact that I have an Uncle Bob was overwhelming. And I may have not so gently accused him of knowing my Uncle Bob and confused the both of us more than anything. But things like that, possibly not to the extent that I embarrassed myself on that day, making sure that we're not using phrases that are just common for you because it could just be very confusing for the other person. Be cautious about the words that you're using, the idioms that you use, and how that other person might interact with it or might not. Making sure that we're allowing time to process is also really important. That's not just giving them information, letting them go away, and then coming back a little while later and making sure that they've understood it, but also in the moment. So ensuring that the person, whether you're asking them a question or telling them information, has sufficient time in that moment to take the information, process it, and formulate a response and get it back to you. Allow yourself to sit in silence for a little bit of time. Make sure that they have got the information that they need and understand how they can best respond to it before assuming that they are either not going to respond or didn't understand you. Giving that time might make the difference of how they feel like they can communicate with you and how comfortable they feel to just sit there and take in what you've just told them or asked them. Visual support is a huge part as well. So there are some people that can struggle to read things that are written down in written word, or they just struggle to process the information in a written way. There was an example that I was given going back a couple of years ago that I believe it was NRN was working with a group of people, or they created a document for non-English speaking service users, and they ended up having photos on that to allow the person to understand what was being asked of them. It was found that even though that was designed specifically for people who did not speak English or English not as their first language, it was really beneficial to people who were potentially struggling to process the written word. So allowing alternatives in terms of the support or information that you're providing them is really helpful to consider, at least. As I was speaking about before with the sensory difficulties, it's really important to try and reduce any environmental stimuli, any stresses that might come from that. Consider your environment as a whole, the lighting, the people around, the sounds, whether there's a door slamming in the background or whatever it might be, making sure that the person feels comfortable where you are and can engage with you in the best possible way. That location or environment is really important. There's potential to offer options. So making sure that we're supporting informed choice and consent, making sure that the person has their voice heard, whether that be, again, the location, the way that information is being given to them, or even just how they're being referred to. Their choice and their consent should be taken into it as paramount. And lastly, make sure that we're asking service users how they prefer to be communicated with. Give that choice back to them, have the open conversation. Like I've spoken about many times, it's really important to get that person's opinion and make them part of the conversation instead of assuming that adjustments that you make that work for one person will automatically work for someone else, even if they're presenting similarly. I think a lot of the times when we're talking about SMD in general, we talk about the barriers that people face. If you compound that with potential neurodivergence or differences in how someone's brain works, you tend to find more barriers start to pop up. If you're looking at services specific for someone's condition, or if you're looking at autism or ADHD specific support, they tend to require diagnoses. If anyone knows about the process of trying to obtain a diagnosis for any of these kind of neurodivergent traits, especially autism and ADHD, you tend to need quite a lot of background information. You'll need a report from someone who has known you for a long time, most likely back to when you were a child, and you'll need school records or at least some type of an informant report of how you behaved or managed in school. A lot of the times the people that we work with don't have the long-lasting family connections, or there's trauma involved. There may have been, it wouldn't be appropriate to ask them for their input on things like informant's report for a diagnosis, and it tends to be that people go without. I think that if someone's aware of support they need, that is great. But if the diagnosis is getting in the way of specific support, it just creates another barrier for them in some cases. There's also differences in socialization. So the conversational skills that come involved or the nonverbal communication, I've already mentioned it, but for things like doctor's appointments or signing up for benefits, going to the DWP, whatever it might be, they tend to be structured fairly rigidly. If someone is unable to sit in that setting, in that service for as long as it takes for their name to be called or the steps to be taken for them to log into whatever account it is, it tends to be more time them having to sit, focus, make sure that they're not moving around. It might not be practical for people to engage in that setting. Some services just aren't set up to work in a neurodivergent way, and it can create more barriers for them to get the support that they need. It tends to turn into a little bit of a catch-22 situation. There's also the non-verbal communication side of things. So again, making sure that we're accessing services. If there was an example of someone who the only way that they could process difficult information or emotions was to get up and move around, but this person was a larger build male, and it made some services feel uncomfortable, felt like he was threatening, but it was just his way of processing the information that was coming, and it created so many barriers to him accessing services purely because he was trying to process and navigate the information he was getting in a way that worked best for him. So making sure that we're understanding behaviors and where they might stem from is a huge part of making sure that services are actually accessible. There's also an aspect around neurodivergence in females or in women going unnoticed. It can be much more difficult to find it, and there's a lot of research that suggests that females are diagnosed much later in life, specifically for things like ADHD and autism. There tends to be a little bit more of a social pressure sometimes, at least from what the research is saying and from personal experiences as well, being diagnosed so late, that it tends to go missed. Their experiences are much different to what the diagnostic pathways are set up as. It tends to be set up from a younger male presentation, and even more so a younger white male presentation. And it makes a very rigid or potentially a narrow hole for who actually gets through for the diagnostic stage. Another aspect is that society is set up for neurotypicals. It tends to lead to a lack of consideration in general. The world is set up in a way that it benefits people whose brain functions in the typical state, like I was talking about, whatever that might mean for the person. But it can lead to a lack of consideration of how that might impact someone who is neurodivergent. We were talking about GP appointments, talking about the fact that loads of things are now set up virtually. Some people might not interact with that very well. There's also, lastly, a belief that neurodivergent goes away in adulthood. It can lead to infantilization or believing that people are coming across as perpetual children. There have been so many times that I've been working with someone and staff start treating them like they are a child because they have got suspected ADHD or autism, or they struggle to sit still for too long. That infantilization or perpetual child outlook that people might have put onto them, it can be really damaging, not only for the way they view themselves, but the way that they feel like they can access services and the way services view them as a person. I'm going to go on to masking and stimming. There are words that you may have heard previously, you may have not. Starting with masking, it's a term that is used when neurodivergent people have to change their behaviors. It can be in minuscule ways, it can be in quite major ways, but they tend to be in ways that are seen to be more socially acceptable. They might end up mimicking certain neurotypical social behaviors. They might end up practicing what they have seen other people do so that they come across in a way that feels more socially acceptable. Some examples of this might be trying to put up with very difficult situations, loud noise, music, lights, because it's what other people are doing and you want to fit in. It could be things like practicing your facial expressions to make sure that your face is matching whatever emotion. It could be laughing at jokes, even if you don't understand why you're all laughing. It ties in from very large ways to kind of microscopic changes in someone's personality. Neurodivergent people might mask in order to protect themselves from discrimination, harassment, or having their condition being outed. It tends to be in a way of being socially conditioned in some cases to act in a way that people don't end up recognizing or looking or gawking at you. Whatever those might actually look like is different for every person. When I was younger, I used to do a thing when I got very excited where I felt it through my whole body. My hands would shake, my arms would shake. And I noticed as I got older that people would look at me before I actually knew what masking or stimming actually was, put any words to it. I knew that people looked at me when I moved in a certain way, when I reacted to something in an outward way, whether that be vocally or visibly with my body. And it tended to manifest itself in the way that I would change my behaviors. I tended to always have something around my wrist that I would kind of snap, or I would constantly be drawing, writing things down, shaking my legs, biting or picking my nails, whatever that might look like. It was a way of me going through what these stimming behaviors were and making them as small as I possibly could, so it was only really seen by me. Over time, people who are masking, it could become unintentional. A person might not be aware that they're doing it, but the physiological impacts of that are huge. The way it impacts someone's health, their mental health, their well-being can be massive. And it's really important for staff to recognize some of the traits that might look like that, but also, more importantly, recognize what stimming looks like. If you haven't heard the term before, stimming, it's an important way for neurodivergent people to regulate their emotions. I was talking about the examples of what I was doing as a young child. It would be more outward. And now it's things like the constant moving, things like if you can see my hands moving constantly throughout this, talking with my hands, it's trying to do something that maybe you don't realize you're doing it, but it's a repetition using any one of the 5 main senses. Stimming can also be suppressed in years, or 4 years rather, to fit in. It ties into the masking that we were just talking about. But it's really important to recognize and encourage it. If you do see it, make sure that you're not having people shy away from the behaviors that they're showing. It can be so useful for people to communicate, to understand their emotions, to express them, but also just things like being a distraction, solving your boredom, making sure that you're doing something so that it doesn't feel like everything happening in your mind or in front of you feels too overwhelming. It can be as big as people moving around, physically getting up, moving, flapping their arms can be a big one. Or it can be as small as swaying back and forth, constantly having to have something in their hand, wanting to be writing, or having a fidget toy while they're engaging with you. It can go from a very, very large show to something that people are doing in a microscopic way, rather. Recognizing that it's happening is a really important way to try and make sure that you're not inadvertently trying to, maybe not trying to, but inadvertently making that person feel like they are being judged or watched for doing it. So with that introduction kind of out the way, we've spoken about what the traits are, how it might manifest, the way that it might create barriers or some of the challenges that might come up, tying it back into the SND side of things. So how it links back into the partnership this stemmed from the work stream, and tying it back into the services that a lot of you guys are probably working in. When we're talking about neurodivergence and homelessness, we know that there is a huge overlap. There's a much higher prevalence. I'll start initially with the autism side of things. The figures are unclear in a rigid sense, but it suggests that 12% of people facing homelessness will show traits of being autistic, and that's in comparison to the estimated 1.1 of the general population. We know that social and communication difficulties can lead to relationship breakdown or social isolation or feeling they're being pushed away from people. We're also aware that that is a risk factor that can lead to homelessness. We're aware that hostels can be a really difficult environment for anyone, especially for people who might struggle with sensory difficulties, sharing spaces with other people, the constant social interactions that come with hostels. It may increase the risk of rough sleeping for autistic people because it's really difficult to manage that setting and be there for a prolonged period of time. They tend to be shorter stunts and coming back out to an experience that they've got a slight bit of control over. People could really struggle with things like welfare checks in hostels, the fact that there's constantly some type of a noise, there's new staff, new service user coming in that lacks the routine and control that might be found to be beneficial for some neurodivergent people, and the control that's found with rough sleeping or going back to a location that they know that they had that control or a little bit more of a say over what happens to them might feel more comfortable. They also might be more susceptible to abuse or exploitation from others, whether that be misunderstanding people's intentions, forming friendships that they are unaware are potentially exploitative or harmful. But also on the flip side, people knowing that situations might not be the safest for them, but valuing friendship over their own safety because it's been so difficult to achieve in other cases. I've put a little figure here. This comes from, it's a direct kind of clip away from the Autism and Homelessness Toolkit that Homeless Link put out. I've also linked it down here, so when you get the slides, please have a look. It's got a lot more information on this topic than what I can go through today. Stepping away from specifically autism, we also know that there's a much higher prevalence of people who have got ADHD. Experiencing homelessness. So ADHD in people with substance use problem and incarcerated populations is much higher prevalence to that of the general population. We also know that there are outcomes or traits of people experiencing ADHD or common factors that include substance use, involvement with criminal justice system, higher rates of divorce, personality disorder, not completing education, or difficulty maintaining stable employment. We know that all 6 of those are also risk factors for homelessness, and they tie hand in hand to create a little bit of a vicious cycle that people are struggling with or have been for such a long period of time that it leads them into having a little bit less stability over their accommodation, their employment, and leads to getting stuck in that cycle of homelessness. ADHD is likely also to be significantly underdiagnosed in people who are experiencing homelessness. We spoke about difficulties of maintaining or obtaining rather diagnoses in general, but it tends to be missed. A lot of the traits that we find as normal for people who are rough sleeping or in hostels experiencing homelessness in any way, they might struggle to stay at appointments for too long. They might struggle to sit down or engage in a way, or their executive function might be something that we're concerned about. They're seen as such high norms across the homelessness community that it tends to just be found as normal, and the considerations around potential neurodivergence might go missed. We also know that those with ADHD have got a 3.6 times greater risk of being homeless than those without ADHD, as well as the fact that they will likely be homeless for longer than their neurotypical counterparts. Again, struggling to escape that cycle because a lot of the outcomes that make up those ADHD traits or common factors tend to be found in the risk factors of homelessness. And the last part, children with ADHD, if they're not followed up or offered appropriate treatment, are at a higher risk of becoming homeless. I do want to mention that when I say treatment, I'm not saying medication. That's not the be all end all. I'm saying recognition, appropriate adjustments, or reasonable adjustments in how they are treated in school and home life. Also looking at therapies and just a recognition of their own understanding so that they can form healthier coping mechanisms instead of feeling that they are struggling and not understanding why. We spoke a little bit about the addiction side of things, but there is huge links between neurodivergence and addictions, and we know the prevalence, especially in people who've got severe multiple disadvantage. There was a study that was completed in Sweden, I believe it was in 2019 and 2020, and the findings from that study showed that neurodivergent people are twice as likely to form substance dependencies than the neurotypical counterparts. Furthermore, it said that individuals who had a dual diagnosis of both ADHD and autism were even at a greater risk of developing addictions. We know that ADHD impacts on impulsivity, but it's also mixed with the inability to regulate dopamine levels. For those of you who don't know, dopamine is a chemical in your brain that impacts that's created from the pleasure hormone is what they tend to call it. People with ADHD, the way that the brain processes dopamine means that they tend to get stuck with more dopamine being taken at a time, leaving them with a deficit in some cases. Individuals with ADHD tend to crave a quick release of dopamine. Not only can it be found in a range of addictions, but it tends to also fit into the experiences of homelessness and constantly being in that fight or flight, high adrenaline levels, and figuring out what's going to benefit you there and then because you're in survival mode so constantly. When we look at addictions and the quick release of dopamine that it gives you, we're also not just talking about substances. That can tie into gambling. It can tie into eating disorders. It can tie into even some people forming addictions around social media. It tends to be quite prevalent in people with ADHD. There's also really high links between ADHD and eating disorders. Again, we're looking at the fact that all of this research suggests that the links between homelessness and neurodivergence makes a lot of sense because of the predisposing factors that can lead to addiction or difficulties in impulse control. Lastly, we also know that autistic individuals report that substance use might make socialization less stressful. They might find it easier to interact with the world and the people around them when they have got something that can potentially numb or get rid of the sensory difficulties, or might make it easier for them to feel a bit less stressed about the situation that's in front of them, especially if it's a new situation or new people. I think it's really important to look at what potential functions might come up when we're talking about substance use, especially the overlap of neurodivergence. Substance use can potentially benefit people who are experiencing sensory difficulties. So it's been said that substances can provide sensory input and stimulation, or on the other side, it can really help to dampen down the impact of sensory inputs if someone is experiencing sound or maybe the lights potentially in a way that impacts them to a great level. The substances might be able to dampen that and make it a little bit easier for them to engage with the people around them or sit there in the discomfort when they know they've got something that's dampening down the impacts of that sensory difficulty. We also spoke very briefly about the executive function, but essentially that is a very layman's way of explaining it. When you're telling your brain to do something and the actual execution of that thing being done. So from point A of wanting to achieve something to actually getting it done, that is your executive functioning. Sometimes people who've got neurodivergence can have executive dysfunction or struggles with their executive functioning, and getting that A to B is not as simple of a path as it could be for other people. There could be difficulties resisting impulses, more likely that engage in activities that provide immediate short-term pleasure but have the long-term consequences. So we were talking about the addiction side of things, but we can also be talking about engagement with people. So if you're a member of staff trying to engage someone who struggles with their executive function, it could be very difficult for that impulse of them not being there or just telling you to leave is much greater to provide the immediate pleasure than having the long-term consequences. Sometimes it's a function of substance use, because the difficulties in resisting that immediate pleasure can outweigh the long-term consequences, especially when we've got the adrenaline or fight or flight as an issue that we were talking about previously. Lastly, speaking about social isolation, it's very typical that people could feel lonely or isolated, and it could lead to the likelihood of them using substances in order to cope with that. It could also reduce the stresses or the pressures related to socialization and make it easier for them to interact, as I mentioned, with the world or the people around them. If you're exploring as a member of staff the functions of why someone is using substances, it might be helpful in developing that person's self-understanding and self-compassion, that it's not necessarily an outright negative, but it could be really beneficial for them to soothe themselves or make sure that they are using it in a way that is beneficial to them. If they've got that understanding, it could give them a little bit more compassion for themselves. If we're looking at the research of neurodivergence and substance use, we know that clinicians are not often experienced in that overlap. So we tend to find pockets of good practice, but the overlap is very difficult to try and find. It's much more prevalent now, but it is a difficulty that's still faced. We're also aware from research that people with autism have much higher levels of substance use to neurotypicals. We went through the reasons why that was previously. And we know that substance use could worsen the difficulties that people have with their daily functioning. It could be a disposing factor for offending. It could lead to a greater likelihood of that behavior or the outcomes of that substance use leading into that cycle of SMD worsening again and again. There could also be difficulties with executive functioning. It could be seen as a risk factor for addiction, which again, as we mentioned, is prevalent for a number of individuals who are neurodivergent. There was a piece of research that was done that I always like to include in these sessions because it brings back the first person experience, the lived experience of this. These were quotes taken from people who are autistic or autistic individuals experiencing SMD. The first one, talking about using it to increase social confidence, said, "Well, I just said it makes me feel sociable. I can talk to people much easier if I've had a drink. Otherwise, I find it very difficult to. I've always had trouble expressing what I think because it's quite hard for me, I think, to stop my brain long enough to talk in a fluid way." So again, that ties right back into what we were talking about previously and the ability to interact with people around them and the lack of pressure that might come from using substances as a form to cope. And then the other two, specifically for using it as self-medication or a coping mechanism. So one discussing heroin use states that it's like you don't get depressed very much. You don't feel bad when you've done things wrong, but you also don't get very emotional. And the other said, yeah, it made me feel better. It felt sort of the world was a dull, dull, grey place, like the way EastEnders is. And when I started drinking, the world got colourful. So we're at the kind of 50-minute mark. Just things to leave you with before we go into the Q&A. As I've been mentioning the whole time, curiosity is really the key I'll keep going back to. Make sure that you're keeping your eye out. Make sure that you're trying to recognize these traits or difficulties, challenges that might come up in service users, but avoid making those sweeping assumptions. It can tend to get you into a very rigid place of thinking, making sure that we're looking at it from a broad aspect and being professionally curious about what's in front of us can lead to better outcomes. We also need to be sure that we're utilizing the resources that we've got available to us. So if you've got psychologists within your team, making sure that you've got formulation meetings happening, making sure that you're speaking and having consultations with your team involving the doctors, the GPs. This is really important for staff to bear in mind, but also making sure that you're using every resource you've got available to service users to make sure that they've got the best outcomes possible and they've got as many different options that they can, whether that be for support, guidance, signposting, making sure that you're using those resources on both ends. It's also important to make sure that a lot of the adjustments that we've just discussed, you bear in mind that they can be used without needing a diagnosis or even without needing to suspect that that person is likely neurodivergent. They're not going to hurt if someone is not neurodivergent. You can always try it. It might stick, it might not. A lot of these things might not work for someone who is definitely diagnosed as being neurodivergent. They might work great with someone who is potentially neurotypical. All we're trying to do is make sure that you're thinking about differences or adjustments that you can make, that again, that drop curb is going to benefit the wider community. It's also important that we're putting the individual's wishes and choice first. So whether that be about treatment, adjustment, seeking diagnosis, that informed choice and person-centered approach is the best thing that we can encourage staff to do. Making sure that we're flexible and person-centered. We're meant to be supporting the person, working with them, not imposing anything on them. I think that's all for me.